Texas, with his wife Karen and his 9-year-old daughter. He was known to be a devoted husband and father who spent much of his off time supporting various charitable causes. On January 28th of that year, Karen and their daughter decided to leave Amarillo and go to Dallas to spend the weekend shopping together. David, who would normally go with them, decided to stay home because he did not want to miss the Super Bowl, which was that Sunday, the 31st. So Karen and their daughter left, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st, they returned to Amarillo, and they actually got back to their house right after the Super Bowl had ended. And so they anticipated going into the house and finding David either cleaning up after himself or maybe watching the post game. But when they walked in, the TV was still on and turned to the channel the Super Bowl had been on, but David was nowhere to be found. Karen noticed that the VCR was actually still recording. David was known to record all major sports games and watch them again, and so clearly he had not turned off the recording. As Karen walked around the house yelling for her husband, she wasn't that concerned. She figured he must have stepped out or something, but she went into the kitchen and she opened up the fridge and she found there was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches on it, which was a sandwich David would often make. And she thought that was pretty weird that he would have made them and then let them sit inside the fridge. And so she closed the fridge and turned around, and on the counter in the kitchen was his wedding band and his watch. And so even though there were all these kind of strange things that Karen was finding in the house, she really wasn't that concerned. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign the house had been burglarized. There was no sign of a struggle. And so she assumed her husband must have stepped out to watch the second half of the game at a friend's house and that he would be back later. And so Karen stayed up for a little while, but then ultimately she went to bed thinking he would be there in the morning. But the next morning when she got up, there was no sign of her husband, and so she went to the police. Within 24 hours, the police located David's abandoned car downtown near the courthouse. Under one of the car's floor mats, they located his car keys as well as his house keys. And then within the car, they found his checkbook, his credit cards, and his driver's license, all in the places they should be. They looked into his bank activity, and they saw there was a recent deposit for $5,000 into his family's account. They also saw that he recently purchased 2 plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas to Amarillo, but it wasn't clear if he had used either of these tickets. When Karen was told about the found car and the strange bank activity, she told police that her husband had recently told her that he actually thought he might be in danger because he was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month in a conflict of interest case between his old law firm and a wealthy client. And David was being pressured to cover up some of the wrongdoings of his previous law firm, and he just wasn't willing to do that. He told his family that he was going to tell the truth no matter who it hurt. David understood that put a huge target on his back. While police were certainly intrigued at this new information, they didn't have any evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David. It was just a conspiracy. And so for 11 months, they looked for new leads and new information, but nothing came out, and David never popped up. He never called home. There was no sign of him. And so after 11 months, the police decided that David must have left of his own accord and that there was no foul play here, and so they closed the case. And after that, David's family unfortunately just had to accept the fact that he was gone and that more than likely no one was ever going to find him again. But in 2004, a state trooper in Washington state was on the internet just researching unsolved mysteries, and he came across a picture of David Lewis. And immediately he recognized that he looked exactly like an unidentified victim of a hit and run case he covered back in 1993. And so he pulled up the details of this hit and run, and he found the victim had been struck a day after David Lewis had gone missing. When this John Doe got hit, he was dressed head to toe in military clothing. He had no bags, he had no ID, and he was walking aimlessly down Highway 24 in Washington state, so 1,600 miles away from Amarillo, Texas, where David Lewis had gone missing. But despite the enormous distance between these two events, this trooper was convinced David Lewis was this John Doe. But as he's looking at the picture of David Lewis, he realizes he has glasses, and he didn't think the John Doe was wearing glasses. But just to be sure, he checked the belongings list of the John Doe, and it said he did have glasses. And it was the exact same kind that David was wearing in the picture. And eventually, DNA would confirm that David Lewis was the John Doe. Now, this solved the mystery of where David Lewis went, but it did not solve the mystery of why he went there. Why did David go to Washington, a place where he has no ties? And if David was the one who hit record on his VCR on the night of the Super Bowl, that means he would have only had less than 24 hours to move 1,600 miles to Washington state without his car. And why was he wearing military clothing? Was that his clothing? Did he buy it? Did someone make him wear it? Where was his luggage? What was he doing walking down the highway? David's assertions to his wife that his life was in danger, his demeanor as a loving family family man, and the nature of his job as an attorney has many people, his family included, believing that he was the victim of foul play. But officially, the police have said David left the house of his own accord and his death was ruled an accident. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day, at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband Mike about this guy Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work, can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target, and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory, and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really, really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife, and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "Death to Her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was 31 years old and living in Surrey, British Columbia. Although in the past he had struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism, over the previous 2 years he had really gotten his act together and got a great job as a foreman at a local construction company. He was known to be a cheerful and friendly guy that did not have any known enemies. But that summer, Blair started exhibiting uncharacteristic mood swings that his mother would describe as being frequent and wild. In a matter of weeks, Blair transformed from being very calm and relaxed and friendly to being totally panicked all the time and always looking over his shoulder, and he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep at night. And he began telling his coworkers that he was fairly certain someone was trying to kill him. And they would say to him, "Blair, I don't think you're okay. You really need to see a doctor." When his mother confronted him about his erratic, paranoid behavior, he told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." And she said, "What's it?" And he said, "Mom, I can't say anything else." And that was it. She could never get any more information out of her son. Blair's strange behavior came to a head on Friday, July 5th, when he went to his bank and withdrew all of the cash out of his account, totaling $6,000. And he also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold. 2 days later, on Sunday, he left his house and drove 30 minutes to the Canada-USA border, and he attempted to enter the United States. But being a single guy carrying a bunch of cash and jewelry and acting really nervous, he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and so he was denied entry. Frustrated, Blair left and went back to his house, and the next day, which was Monday, he went to his construction site and he abruptly told his boss that he was quitting. And he didn't even pick up his final paycheck, he just left. After leaving the construction site, he went straight to the airport where he promptly purchased a $1,600 round trip to Frankfurt, Germany. Although we don't know why he wanted to go to Frankfurt, Germany, he did work there briefly the year before. His flight was supposed to leave the following day, which was Tuesday, but immediately after purchasing this plane ticket, Blair suddenly decided that he needed to try again to cross into the USA. So he rushed to a friend's house, he knocked on her door, she opens it up and he looks totally disheveled, and he's telling her that someone's trying to kill me, I need your help getting across the border, I just got rejected a couple of days ago, can you please drive me across, you got kids, it'll look much more convincing, can you do that for me? And she was really spooked by his behavior and felt like this is not something I want to get involved with, and so she said, "Sorry, I can't help you." So Blair headed home where he hid out for the day, and then the next day, Tuesday, he went to the airport, but instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, Germany, he went to the front desk and requested a refund, and it was granted. He told them that the person he was going to meet in Germany had gotten sick, and so now he couldn't go. And so the only person he could have been talking about was the girl he had briefly had a fling with when he was there for work the year earlier. But later on, investigators would talk to that German girl, and she would say she was not in touch with Blair, and she definitely was not expecting him. Blair left the airport and rented a car, which was a Nissan Altima, and he immediately went to the US-Canada border, except this time he was able to get across. He made his way to Seattle, Washington, where he went over to their airport, and then abandoned his Nissan in the middle of a parking lot, and then went down and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Now, he paid $770 for this one-way ticket, but he could have just purchased a round trip for half the price. But either way, he boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was in Washington, D.C. He got off the plane and rented another car, which was a Toyota Camry, and then drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair was not seen in Knoxville until about 5:30 p.m. that evening when he showed up at a gas station complaining of car troubles. And so the gas station attendant came out to try to help Blair, and he immediately diagnosed what the problem was. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to his Nissan Altima that he had abandoned in Seattle, Washington. And so the attendant pointed out that it was the wrong key, and Blair held it up and said, "No, this is the one I was using." And the guy's like, "No, it clearly says Nissan on it." And so Blair and this gas station attendant look around the car inside and out for this missing Toyota key. Blair's reaching in his pockets. He can't find it. Blair ends up calling the rental company, but they wind up being closed. And so the gas station attendant says, unfortunately, we're going to have to tow your car, but I'll give you a ride to a nearby hotel. And so Blair accepted the ride. And just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front door of the Fairfield Inn and then promptly turned around and walked out. And then walked in, and then walked out. Over and over again, 5 separate times over the course of an hour before he finally walked up to the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk attendant at the hotel said Blair was totally paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, and just totally on edge the entire time. And then after she gave him his room and he paid for it, he took the key, and instead of going up to his room, he just walked out again and then never came back. The following morning, 2 workers arrived at their construction site right across the street from the Fairfield Inn, and they discovered a body, and it would turn out to be Blair's. He was missing his socks, shoes, and pants, and he had scratches on his hands as well as on his face, but none of the abrasions were that significant. There was $4,000 in German, US, and Canadian currencies lying on the ground around him. Also spread out around Blair was his fanny pack full of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold, a black duffel bag that contained maps and receipts, and then also that missing Toyota car key that they could not find the night before. That was lying on the ground as well. Blair's autopsy showed that he had died from a single violent blow to his stomach, but they had no idea what actually struck his stomach. Toxicology reports showed that Blair had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was clutching in his fist. But there's no more information about this hair online. There were no witnesses, but there was a security guard who claimed to have heard screaming, a woman's scream, coming from the area where Blair was discovered at about 3:30 in the morning. The only lead police had was the sketch of this guy that apparently people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant right after Blair had left the hotel. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were baffled. Was Blair telling the truth that someone had been trying to kill him for weeks leading up to his death and they finally caught up to him? And if so, why didn't he tell authorities? Or was Blair delusional and he just happened to run into another killer when he was in Tennessee? Unfortunately, we still have absolutely no idea. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a nice hot cup of coffee when they wake up in the morning, and then proceed to make them a lukewarm, extremely weak cup of coffee with too much milk and too many Splendas. On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazzaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they had made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet. And so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all 3 sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp, down the trail, and they find their instructor instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall. They get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do, and they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called, and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water. He went around the corner, so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a moulin, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. But after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went, deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet. And so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered. In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. And their employees knew this because all the time corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. To picture this oven in your head, think of the scanner you put your luggage through at the airport, the X-ray machine. It's kind of like that. It was this 80-foot long metal tunnel where there was a conveyor belt that ran through it, and you would put dough on one side and it would run through with the conveyor belt through this oven, and then on the other side it would be fully cooked. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven. So not just the heat, but the whole operation needed to be completely shut down, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose $1,500. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic, and if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. And so they came up with a plan. Even though the oven sat flush to the ground, there was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. And so they thought, well, hey, if we just remove a couple of sections of the conveyor belt, when that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over and walk along inside of the oven, staying in that gap until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. The managers were confident, and so they began walking around the factory asking for volunteers, and they were offering offering extra pay. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job, and their managers told them they would do it the next day because they needed time to turn the heat off on the oven and let it cool down first. That night, David was out with his friends and he was talking about how he was kind of nervous about getting inside of a semi-operational industrial oven, but he told them the money was good. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and there were fans blowing into it, and it had been off for a couple of hours, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. A few sections of the conveyor belt were removed, Ian was given a radio, and the two men opened the side to the oven, and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven, and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up, and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, hey, it's really hot in here. And the manager came back and said, don't worry, it's supposed to be a little warm in there, but it's nothing that can hurt you. And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, no, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here. And so one of the managers ran over and checked the temperature gauge, which unbelievably no one had done to that point. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to boil water in the center of this oven. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. The belt could not go in reverse, and the fastest it could move is 17 minutes start to finish, so agonizingly slow. And they could not crawl up or below the conveyor belt in either direction. There wasn't enough clearance, and they'd get sucked up into the machinery. So they literally had to stay in the gap and slowly walk towards the hottest section of the oven. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. And even if they hit the emergency stop button on the oven, it wouldn't help them because the heat inside of the oven is not because it's on, it was residual heat. And by turning off the oven, that would just stop the conveyor belt, trapping Ian and David in the hottest part of the oven. Workers ran and got their tools and did everything they could to try to dismantle portions of the oven to try to get down to Ian and David. But by the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. Something most people don't know is you can't just put scuba tanks on and then dive down to any depth and come right back up again. The compressed air inside of those scuba tanks would be a mixture of oxygen as well as most likely helium and nitrogen. And when you're breathing that compressed air, the oxygen would get breathed up and then not linger inside of your body. But the other inert gases, the helium and the nitrogen, they would be breathed up and then absorbed into your bloodstream, and they would stay there until you resurfaced. Now, it's completely harmless as long as you understand how it works getting those gases out of your body. In a nutshell, as you ascend, these inert gases will leave your body on their own, but it's a gradual process. If you rocket to the surface before this takes place, these inert gases will not leave your body and they'll expand inside of you, and your body will become the equivalent of a shaken up soda can. And so at best, having all these bubbles inside of you is very painful. At worst, it's lethal. The term for this condition is decompression sickness, but it's better known as the bends. The way divers protect themselves from getting the bends is on their ascent, they do what's called a decompression stop. This is something that is planned into the dive where they stop at a certain depth for a certain amount of time, and that guarantees the inert gases have diffused out of their body before they reach the surface. Now, the deeper you go, the more decompression stops you'll have to do, and the longer they will take. For example, ascending from 2,000 feet would take over 33 hours to do safely. But luckily, none of us are trying to dive down to 2,000 feet. Well, unless you're trying to be an oil and gas saturation diver. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, do construction and demolition at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. But they don't spend 33 hours ascending after every single dive. Instead, after their dives, they're artificially kept at their working depth. The way this works is the SAT diver climbs inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship or on board an oil rig, and this chamber also doubles as their living quarters. There's beds, beds and there's a bathroom, but it's laughably small and uncomfortable. It looks like a small submarine. And once they go inside, they seal the door and then they pressurize it to match the depth that they're going to be working at the bottom of the ocean. And then also there's another pressure chamber called the dive bell that's connected directly onto the side of the chamber. And that's also pressurized to match the working depth. When it was time for the sat diver to go to work, they would put their dive gear on inside of the chamber. They would crawl directly into the dive bell. They would shut the door behind them and seal it. And then people outside of the dive bell would physically disconnect it from the chamber. And then using a crane, they would place it in the water and then lower it down to their working depth. And once they get down there, because the pressure inside the bell is equal to the pressure outside the bell, they can just slide open a door on the bottom and the water does not come inside. And so the divers do slip through this hole and they do the work they need to do. And when they're done, they come back inside the dive bell, they shut it up, and then using the radio, they communicate with the people up on the boat or up on the rig, and they raise the bell back up, they reattach them to the chamber, they go inside, they take their stuff off, there's bunk beds and there's a bathroom inside of the chamber, and that's where they hang out until their next dive. This process is repeated for days and days and days, keeping them saturated with these gases. And then at the end of their shift, which is usually about a month long, they will have one long decompression they do inside of the chamber. While this system is highly efficient, it does not change the fact that saturation diving is extremely dangerous and terrifying. The sun doesn't reach below 700 feet, so most of the time these divers are in complete and total darkness, and it's unbelievably cold down there. And so their suits have hot water pumped into them through a tether that's connected to the dive bell. But if that were to fail, hypothermia would kick in almost immediately. They have flashlights, but the water is so full of sediment around the areas that they work that shining the light is basically like shining it into fog. You can't really see very far besides right in front of your face. Sat divers also report that sometimes the water around them will suddenly move violently and they'll look around, but their crummy light and lack of visibility means they can't see what it was, but they know it's a large animal that's checking them out. Other times, these fairly large fish will swim right up to them and come right under their light. It's almost like they're being affectionate with the diver. But they're not being affectionate. They're trying to hide behind the sat diver from some large predator that's out there watching them. Experienced sat divers have learned to just accept their harsh environment down there and don't easily get scared. But there is one thing that all sat divers are afraid of, and that is a lost bell. When sat divers are down at their working depth, the dive bell that's brought them down there is usually situated right next to them, just kind of floating in the water. And this dive bell is connected to the ship or the oil rig above by a cable. And if that cable were to snap, the dive bell would fall to the bottom and it would take with it the divers because they're always tethered to the dive bell. If the divers survived the crash to the ocean floor, they would then just be trapped and have to hope that someone comes down to get them at some point before they run out of air or they succumb to hypothermia. While a lost bell scenario is incredibly rare, it has happened before. On August 7th, 1979, Richard Walker was inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship in the North Sea. He was a saturation diver who for the past 10 days had been in saturation and honestly was just over it. He wanted to go home to his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, before his scheduled dive, he wrote in his journal, "Dear God, I just want to get out." Soon after writing this entry, he and his partner, Victor Giel, put on their dive gear and hopped into the dive bell. The bell was detached from the chamber and then brought over to the side of the ship, and right before they lowered it into the water, somebody noticed the location transponder that basically beamed up where it was down below had become loose, and so the decision was made to just remove it. And so after they pulled it off, they lowered the dive bell onto the water and then slowly lowered it down to their working depth, which was 485 feet. Once they got down there, they opened up the hole at the bottom of the bell, and then they began taking turns exiting the bell to go work on this underwater structure. A few hours later, at 2:45 in the morning, Richard was the one outside of the dive bell, and he heard something behind him, and he turned around and he saw the dive bell had slightly tilted on its side. Right as he noticed this, the radio in his helmet kicked on and told him he needed to go back inside the dive bell immediately, and they were going to try to pull them back up. And so Richard went inside the bell, he closed the hole behind him, and then he and Victor listened to the radio as they told them that the main cable holding the dive bell had slipped out. Now, this main cable was not the only thing connecting the dive bell up to the ship. There was also another clump of wires and tubes that was called the umbilical that ran all their power and hot water and their comms down to the dive bell. But this umbilical was not meant to be load-bearing. But as it stood with this main cable gone, the umbilical was holding the dive bell from slipping to the bottom of the ocean. And so the crew up on the ship decided their only choice was to use the umbilical to reel this dive bell back in. And so they began pulling them up by the umbilical, and almost immediately it completely snapped, and the dive bell fell to the bottom of the ocean about 50 feet below. Now, normally a dive bell would have what's called a clump weight hanging off the bottom of it. And in an emergency, you could detach this clump weight, and the dive bell is buoyant enough, it would go up to the surface. But Richard and Victor's company had cut corners and not used a clump weight, and instead attached weights directly to the dive bell, which meant when they hit the ocean floor, the actual dive bell was sitting on the ocean floor, where that hole they would normally escape from was pressed into the seabed, so they could not get out of their dive bell. Whereas if there had been a clump weight, the clump weight would have hit the ground and the dive bell would have hovered slightly over it. And so worst case scenario, they could have gotten out and done a wet transfer into another dive bell. So with the umbilical cut, they had no radio communication, they had no heat, they had no light, and they had very little remaining oxygen. And so all they could do was just sit in darkness and hope somebody rescues them. Less than 30 minutes later, another dive ship arrived and offered to help. Now, they were not expecting to dive that night, so it took about 3 hours before they actually had their rescue divers in the water. And unfortunately, because the location transponder had been removed from the dive bell before Richard and Victor went under, it made it almost impossible for these rescue divers to find it. But after an hour of looking around, they finally found it. It was 7 a.m. and they went right down to the porthole and they shined a light inside of the dive bell, and inside Richard and Victor are given a thumbs up like, hey, we're okay, we're just ready to get rescued. The fact that Richard and Victor were okay was communicated back up to the surface, and everybody on top was so excited, so relieved. And in fact, they called Richard's wife and they told her that, hey, there's been an accident, but your husband's just fine, he'll be out very soon. But despite these rescue divers locating the dive bell, because the ship up above that they were attached to kept moving around, it was proving to be extremely difficult for them to stay over the dive bell. And so for the next 2 hours, these rescue divers desperately tried to thread a new wire through the top of the dive bell, but it was going so poorly, and they kept going around and shining their light into the porthole to check on Richard and Victor. And it was very clear that their situation was getting worse and worse by the second. They were not giving thumbs up and smiling. They looked panicked and desperate, and they'd been without heat now for hours, and it was obvious they were running out of oxygen. Finally, at 9 a.m., so 6 hours after Richard and Victor had first hit the sea floor, the rescue divers managed to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell. And before they signaled to have it brought back up again, they shined a light through the porthole to check on them one more time, and they saw that Richard and Victor were just sitting there with their head in their hands. They were clearly still alive and lucid, but it was like they understood they have very little time left, and if this doesn't work, they're doomed. At this point, the rescue divers called up and said it was ready. They got pulled up to the surface, and then the ship began pulling up the dive bell, and almost immediately the cable snapped. And everybody up on the surface knew that at this point, it was almost impossible for them to survive. But nonetheless, rescue divers went down, and it took a while to find the dive bell because it had moved. But when they did, they shined the light through the porthole, and Richard and Victor were still very much alive, but they were not looking to interact with the divers at the window anymore. They were just sitting there looking down. They were despondent. It was like they were making peace with what they understood was going to happen. They were not going to get out of there. And over the course of the next several hours, as these rescue divers tried desperately to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell, they kept checking on Richard and Victor, and each time they checked, they would slouch lower and lower in their seats until both of them were laying on their side. And then finally, the rescue divers got a cable through the top, and then afterwards, they went back up to the ship, and then the ship was able this time to pull the dive bell up and back on board. But when they opened the door, both Richard and Victor had passed away. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button that you really like their new haircut, but secretly have your fingers crossed behind your back. In June of 1982, 38-year-old Cindy Hack divorced her husband, Roy. As soon as she moved into another home in Vancouver, Canada, she felt this wave of relief come over her. Their marriage had become abusive and toxic years ago, but her newfound happiness would be short-lived. Only 4 months after leaving her husband, Cindy's waking nightmare would begin. It all started with a late-night phone call on October 7th, 1982. When she answered, the voice on the other side was raspy and angry-sounding. It addressed Cindy by name and quickly told her that they planned on hurting her. And before Cindy could do anything, the caller had hung up. Cindy was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she did nothing. And then over the next few days, she received more calls from this phantom caller, and each of them began with this person addressing her by name and then threatening violence. And Cindy began to convince herself that this had to be some terrible prank, and so she continued to do nothing about it. One night, Cindy couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, and she looked into her living room and she noticed one of her windows was still open. At night, she would draw all the curtains in her house. And so she walked over to the window and she pressed her face up against the glass to look outside, and she didn't see anybody out there. And so she drew the curtains, turned around, and began walking back towards the kitchen when her phone rang. She hesitated, but eventually picked the phone up, and on the other side of the call was the mystery caller, who in a mocking tone told her that curtains weren't going to protect her, that they knew when she was home. This incident pushed her over the edge, and she knew this could not be some bad prank. This was real. And so she contacted the police, who made a house visit, but there wasn't any sign of a break-in or any sign of a crime being committed. And so after walking her property and feeling confident that she was safe, they told her that, you should really consider getting an unlisted telephone number. That way this mystery person can't keep contacting you. And so Cindy thanked them and would go on to get an unlisted telephone number. But not only would the calls continue, they would become more frequent. And in fact, the harassment in general only began to escalate. 3 days later, on October 15th, Cindy and her good friend Agnes were coming back from dinner to Cindy's house. And when they got there, they noticed that one of the front windows had been broken. And so they carefully walked onto the porch and realized the front door was actually unlocked and slightly ajar. They considered immediately leaving the property and just calling police, but they sat there for a minute and didn't hear anything inside the house, and so they decided they would just poke their head in and investigate. And so when they went inside, all the lights were off and there was no sign of a disturbance. It was totally quiet. But when they went upstairs, they found feathers all over the hall. And they followed those feathers all the way to Cindy's room, and in her room, all of her pillows had been ripped apart, and a key to her front door was laying conspicuously on her bedside table. The women fled the house and called police, but when they showed up, there really wasn't much they could do, despite knowing about Cindy's threatening phone calls she was getting. There was just no clear sign of who broke into her house and cut up her pillows. And so they told her that the best thing she can do is change her locks, make sure everything in her house stays locked at all times when she's home, and if she notices anything out of the ordinary, to call back. Over the following few days, Cindy got more threatening phone calls and began waking up to threatening notes laying on her front porch that had been made from newspaper and magazine clippings. This led to the police launching a larger investigation into the matter. An officer named Pat McBride, who had been on the force for 8 years, began checking in on Cindy almost daily. And very quickly, Pat and Cindy developed a romantic relationship, and Pat actually moved into Cindy's house while he was investigating this case. As soon as Pat moved in, the harassment seemed to stop. But just a couple of weeks later, in early November, Pat woke up one morning at Cindy's house and discovered that her phone lines were dead. When he went outside to investigate, he discovered that the lines had actually been cut, and he found a pair of wire cutters laying on the ground. Over the following month, in addition to the threatening phone calls and notes left on her porch, Cindy began hearing somebody walking around outside her house at night, but she was always too terrified to go to the window and look outside to see who it was. She began finding raw meat sitting outside of her door in the morning, and she would find pictures of dead bodies tucked under her windshield wiper on her car. One day, she walked into her backyard and she discovered 3 dead cats hanging in her garden. Cindy, who was a bubbly, happy person before the harassment started, had become a totally anxious and paranoid mess. But despite her obvious distress, the local police were starting to doubt her claims that the stalker was even real. Every time she called them claiming stalker activity, they would go to her house and look around, but they could never find any evidence to suggest that anyone besides her, her friends, or her boyfriend had been there. And speaking of her boyfriend, police officer Pat McBride, he would tell his coworkers that he was never home when the stalker called, and he never heard anybody walking around outside of her house. He said the only reason he knew about these things is because Cindy told him after the fact. Upset that the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy broke up with Pat and decided she needed to move and start over in another town. Just days before Cindy was supposed to relocate, her friend Agnes stopped by. When she went to the front door and knocked and there was no answer, she walked around to the back and she found her friend crouched down behind the stairs as if she was hiding from something. She ran over to her and noticed she had this black nylon stocking wrapped tightly around her neck, but Cindy seemed to be totally unfazed by it and just kept looking out towards her shed. And so Agnes runs over to Cindy and says, "Cindy, what are you doing? What's on your neck?" And Cindy turned to look at her and her eyes were super wide and she was panicked, and she told Agnes that just minutes ago she had been walking out to her shed to get something when a man leapt out of the shadows and wrapped this nylon around her neck and began choking her and threatened that if she turned around to look at him, he would attack her family. So Cindy and this man struggled for a minute until Agnes's car approached, which spooked the man and he ran off. Agnes was shocked and she grabbed her friend and picked her up. She pulled the nylon off of her neck and the two of them ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. And then at that point, Cindy called the police. But when the police showed up, the only evidence of this attack was Cindy's first-hand account and this nylon stocking. But the police believed the nylon stocking was Cindy's, and she had staged the whole event and she had tied it around her neck herself. A few days later, in January of 1983, Cindy moved into a new home in a town called Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. And as soon as she got there, she painted her car a new color, and she actually changed her last name to James. For months, she didn't see or hear from her stalker. But in October of that year, she found another dead cat on her property with a note next to it that just said, "You're next." Fearing for her life, she called the Richmond police, who set up a surveillance operation on her property. But for months, despite dozens of officers watching her house at practically all hours, they never ever saw any stalker activity. But as soon as the officers left for any amount of time, when there was a gap in surveillance, Cindy would call the police and report stalker activity. In time, this town's police department also began to suspect that Cindy was fabricating the stalker story, and they told her as much. Now, blatantly knowing the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy hired a local private detective named Ozzy Caban to look into her case. Immediately, he installed floodlights all around her property, and he gave her a two-way radio to place inside of her house that constantly broadcast back to Ozzy. That way, if she was in trouble, he would know about it even if she couldn't get to the radio to actually tell him. He also installed a panic button inside of her house that would send an alarm to him as well as to the police. In January of 1984, after only being on the case for a couple of weeks, Ozzy heard some strange sounds coming across the two-way radio. It sounded like there was some sort of struggle happening in Cindy's house. And so he tried radioing her to ask what was going on, but he didn't get a response. And so he flew over to her house, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And so he kicked the door down and found Cindy lying in the hallway motionless with a note on top of her hand that was held in place by a paring knife that had been stabbed through the note and then through her hand. The note said, "You're dead, lady." Cindy also had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. And so initially, Ozzy believed Cindy was dead, but he managed to find a pulse. And so he brought her to the hospital, and when she regained consciousness, all she could recall was feeling someone inject her arm with a needle, and then after that, she had no memory of the attack. The police, believing Cindy had staged the attack, did not bother to take fingerprints at her home or on the knife or on the note. Ozzy, on the other hand, believed his client was telling the truth. He didn't believe Cindy was physically capable of injecting herself in the area where the needle had entered her body. The angle was nearly impossible to achieve on her own. Once she was released from the hospital, the police, despite believing she was lying, continued their surveillance operation of her property. But like always, nothing ever happened when any of the officers were on duty. The stalker activity only was reported after they had left. Life went on like this for over a year, and during that time, Cindy's mental health continued to decline rapidly. She lived in constant fear of this stalker, and she was deeply embarrassed that the police believed she was lying. On December 11th, 1985, Cindy was attacked again, but the details on this are incredibly scant. Someone found her lying in a ditch 6 miles away from her home. She was wearing a single work boot and a single glove. She was suffering from hypothermia, and she had cuts and bruises all over her body, and she had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She had no memory of the attack. The police told her that they believed this was yet another staged event, and so they did not do any significant follow-up. After a few days in the hospital, she was sent home, but she was terrified to be alone. So she reached out to her friend Agnes and asked if she and her husband Tom would stay with her for a couple of days, and they agreed. The first night they were there, Cindy woke up in the middle of the night and heard strange sounds coming from the basement. She woke up Agnes and Tom, and they heard the sounds too, and so they went down to the first floor, they opened up the door to the basement, and they looked downstairs, and very clearly there was a fire raging in her basement. And so Cindy immediately ran to the phone to call 911, but they discovered the phone lines had been cut. And so Tom ran outside to try to find a neighbor to call 911 for them. And when he went outside, he found a man just standing there in front of the house watching it. And Tom yelled to him, "Hey, you need to call 911. This house is on fire." And this man, without saying a word, just turned and ran down the street. And that man was never identified. Finally, Tom did get a neighbor to call 911. The fire department arrived and they put out the fire. And then after an investigation, they determined that the fire had been set intentionally. This was an act of arson. And the police said there was no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, which means someone who was already in the house had to have started the fire. and they specifically said Cindy had to have started the fire because she stages these events all the time because of this stalker delusion she has. Agnes and Tom denied this claim, saying they never heard Cindy walking around at night and she would never jeopardize their lives. After this event, Cindy became extremely depressed and had to be hospitalized, and for 10 weeks she was under intense psychiatric care. But at the end of those 10 weeks, the doctors determined that she was not a threat to herself or to anyone else, and so she was sent home. It was at this time that Cindy went to the police and said that she thinks Roy, her ex-husband, was behind all of the attacks. Police immediately brought Roy in for questioning, and he emphatically denied all allegations, saying he had nothing to do with it, and in fact, he had been the victim of this stalker that was going after his ex-wife. He said he got a number of these threatening phone calls, and one time when they called, they left him a voicemail, and he played it for the police. After speaking with Roy and confirming his various alibis, the police ruled him out as a suspect. For the next 3.5 years, Cindy continued to receive threatening phone calls and messages at her house, but no one besides Cindy ever saw this stuff happen live. While her private investigator, Ozzy, still believed every bit of her story, the Richmond Police Department had grown tired of her and stopped responding to her calls. On the evening of May 25th, 1989, Agnes showed up at Cindy's house for their scheduled game of bridge. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. And because Agnes and Cindy were very close, Agnes tried the front door, it was unlocked, and so she let herself in, thinking Cindy must be upstairs taking a shower. But when she stepped inside, the house was totally silent. And after a couple of minutes of no commotion upstairs, Agnes began searching the house for her friend, and she discovered that Cindy wasn't there, and so she called the police. The police launched a search and very quickly found Cindy's car in a parking lot at a local supermarket. And when investigators went over the car, they discovered there was blood on the outside of the driver's side door. The contents of Cindy's purse, including her credit cards and ID, were scattered about on the ground near the car. And then in the trunk of the vehicle were the groceries that Cindy had recently purchased. But despite her car being found, there was really no indication of where she went next. Her friends and family believed she had been kidnapped by her stalker, and the police believed she was staging yet another event. But regardless, no one could find her. 2 weeks after her disappearance and 1.5 miles away from where her car had been found, a road worker had drank too much coffee and needed to use the bathroom. But where they were working, they did not have a portage on, and they were not near any local businesses that might offer public restrooms. The only area that offered any privacy was the abandoned building that was right near their work site. And so this worker told his crew where he was headed. He turned and began walking across the totally overgrown front yard of this property. And as he began walking around the side of this building, he smelled this horrific smell, like one of the worst smells he'd ever smelled in his life. And he assumed that because this property was abandoned, maybe people were dumping their trash on it somewhere and it's a hot day and that's why it smells. But either way, he wrote it off. He walked around to the back of this building. He found a good spot. He relieved himself. He turned around and began walking back along the side to go back to the road when he stopped, because he saw something lying near the side of the house that he was surprised he hadn't noticed on his way in. He couldn't really see what it was because the tall grass was obscuring his view, and so he took a couple steps forward to get a better look, and when he could see clearly what it was, he stopped. Because laying in front of him was a clearly deceased woman laying on her side with her hands and feet bound behind her back, and around her neck was a black nylon stocking. It was the body of Cindy James. Despite the nylon around her neck, the autopsy revealed she did not die from strangulation. She died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. The police brought in a not expert who was easily able to put himself in the same position that Cindy was in and tie himself up. With this information, combined with their belief that Cindy was a pathological liar, they concluded that this had to have been self-inflicted, that she injected herself with the lethal dose and then dropped down to the ground and tied herself up to stage the epic conclusion to this stalker delusion. To cover their bases, the police did re-interview Roy, the ex-husband, but his alibi checked out and realistically, he was never actually a suspect. It's not listed online whether Pat McBride, the police officer ex-boyfriend, was ever investigated. While the police were very confident in their theory of what happened to Cindy, there were some discrepancies. The medical examiner did not agree with the ruling that this was a suicide. He said that you can't conclude that. There's not enough evidence. During the autopsy, it was discovered discovered that Cindy did have an injection mark in her arm, but they could never find the needle anywhere near her body or anywhere between her and her parked car. Considering the extremely high dosage of narcotic that was found in Cindy's system, if this had been a suicide, as soon as she injected herself, she would have had to immediately shift gears, get down on the ground, and start hog-tying herself before she became too intoxicated to function, meaning the needle should have been right around where she was found. But it wasn't. Also missing from the crime scene were Cindy's shoes and socks. And interestingly, her bare feet were totally clean, despite the fact that in order to get where she was found, she would have had to cover a distance of at least 1.5 miles from her parked car. But again, there was no dirt or any markings on the underside of her feet. Also, it was strange that she wasn't discovered faster than 2 weeks. Although she was found near this abandoned house that was totally overgrown, the house was actually frequented by teenagers, and there was a walking trail nearby that would have had a line of sight on her body. These discrepancies have led many people to believe that Cindy did have a stalker, and this stalker kidnapped her in the supermarket parking lot. They tied her up, they injected her with the lethal dose of morphine, and then after she had died, they dumped her near this abandoned property right before she was found. And they had left that black nylon tied around her neck because that was the stalker's signature. Some have taken this a step further and said Pat McBride, the police officer, was behind the attacks, because he would have known when surveillance was set up on her house and could have very easily avoided detection. But the most bizarre and fascinating theory of what happened to Cindy is that she had dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This is where someone maintains at least 2 distinct personalities, and when one of those personalities is active, the other kind of fades and has no memory of this experience, creating these huge memory gaps. And so the theory goes, one of Cindy's personalities was effectively stalking herself. Or more specifically, one of her personalities hated herself and wanted to do herself harm. And so that personality would do things like stab her own hand or run 6 miles away into some ditch and leave herself for dead. And then Cindy's other personality would take back over, and she would suddenly come to having no memory of how she became injured or how she wound up in this ditch. And so when she went to police to tell them that someone is stalking, is harassing, is attacking me, she was telling the truth. But that someone, that stalker, was actually her. She just didn't know it. But Roy, her ex-husband, was a psychiatrist, and in their 16 years of marriage, he never noticed this condition. And when Cindy was in that psychiatric ward for 10 weeks following one of her stalker attacks, none of the doctors or psychiatrists ever noticed or diagnosed her with this condition. It's still possible she had DID, and it just came on later in life, and it didn't present itself enough to be noticed during those 10 weeks of psychiatric care. But realistically, this reduces the chances of DID being behind this whole thing. To date, her death is still considered a suicide, and no one has ever been charged in connection with her death. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and steal the little plastic clip on their vacuum that keeps the cord nicely tucked up after use. In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect. But looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors, they both got married at almost the exact same time, their kids had grown up together, and now Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luc was his best friend, the policemen said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luc was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first year exam. And without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school. And so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies, and eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. And because he's this very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this lie for almost 20 years. His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody, he has told that he's this successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life. And so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence. But in 2015, he became eligible for parole, and in 2019, he was released. On September 6, 2006, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job as an emergency room nurse in Portland, Oregon. On the way, she stopped at a hair salon to get her hair dyed. While she waited her turn, she picked up a magazine and a particular quote stood out to her. It said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was fighting with her husband, Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and their marriage had become toxic. And Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. And so they had these bitter, awful fights, and Susan was just looking for things to latch onto, and this type of quote gave her motivation to follow through with this very difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair now a slightly different color brown, she hopped back in her car and drove the last couple of miles home to her quiet little neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home with their gray picket fence around it. She went in the back door into their mudroom, and right away she saw a note next to the microwave that her husband had left, because at this time they were still living together. And the note just said, "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days." She put the note down and then unlocked the door that led into the house, which was into the kitchen. And as soon as the door opened up, she heard the beeping sound of their security alarm. And then she walked all the way through the house to the front door. She unlocked it, went outside, and then checked their mail, and then went back inside the house. After she got back inside and had shut and locked the front door behind her, she kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house towards the kitchen. She got about halfway there when she looked over to her left, and she noticed the first floor bedroom that they used as a guest room was really dark. And every morning before she left for work, she would open all the curtains around the house. And so in the evening, the sun would come into the house and it would be nice and bright. And so she's thinking to herself, did I forget to open the curtains in that room? Because it shouldn't be that dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He was medium height, medium build. He had a hat pulled down over his eyes. He had yellow rubber gloves on, and he was holding a hammer. And he began walking right towards her. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house. But not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years. And in that time, she had done things like crack open people's ribs to massage their hearts. She had administered IVs and thrashing patients that were suffering from withdrawals. And she and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense, because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. You needed to be ready to slip chokeholds and defend yourself. And so here Sue was staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. And so Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. She figured if she could just get up close to him, the power of the hammer strikes would be less. And so she rams into him, and she's about 5'5" and significantly outweighed him. He's about 5'9", maybe 200 pounds. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And so she's holding on to him and she's screaming at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" Because there was a part of her that thought, this is a burglary. I'll just give you what you want. But the guy didn't say anything. And so Susan grabbed him and pushed even harder against the wall. And the man would say 2 words. It was the only 2 words he said the entire time. And it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she thought, no, I'm gonna live. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. But when he reached for the hammer, she grabbed his throat and began choking the life out of him. The man immediately went for his throat to get her hand off of him, so he was not trying to attack her. And Susan realized that she had him on the defensive, and she grabbed tighter and tighter around his throat. She moved her other hand up and really started crushing his windpipe. And then she screamed at him, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." And the man looked at her and just grunted at her. And so she continued to squeeze harder and harder until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back. And she knew as an emergency room nurse, if she continued, she would kill him. And she wasn't really prepared to do that. And so she threw him to the ground. She turned and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up and leapt after her, grabbed her by the ankle and tripped her to the ground. When she landed, she rolled over onto her back, and right on top of her is this guy wielding the hammer, and he's about to bring it down on her. And so she instinctively just shot up. She sat up as fast as she could, and she bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard she tore through the fabric. And the guy screamed out in pain. He couldn't even hit her with the hammer. He began staggering back, at which point she released the bite, got up onto a knee, and then bit him again on the side of his rib cage as hard as she could, once again tearing through the fabric. And so now this guy is howling at the top of his lungs, at which point Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground, but she falls with him and she lands directly behind his back. And he's still trying to grab her, and he's got the hammer and he's trying to hit her. And so she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And so the guy is trying to fight and get his neck out of the chokehold, but Susan decided that this guy, he's not going to talk, he's not going to tell me what he wants, he's here to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And she proceeded to choke him to death. And once he stopped moving, she calmly stood up, looked down, knew he was dead. She grabbed his hammer and then calmly walked out the front door, walked to her neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and then her neighbor comes up and sees Sue just standing there with her clothes tattered and she's all bruised and bloodied, but she looks like she's totally okay. And the neighbor asks Sue, "What are you doing? What's going on? Why do you have that hammer?" And Sue would tell her that, "Well, I had an intruder and he tried to kill me, so I killed him. And I need to use your phone to call the police." And so her neighbor's like, "Okay, come on in and use my phone." And so Sue walks in with her hammer in hand and calmly calls the police and tells them what happened. Police and paramedics show up and they go inside of Sue's house and they confirm that her attacker was in fact dead. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey, who was a Vietnam veteran with a long rap sheet. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. And Mike, earlier in the day, had gone to the house and allowed Ed in and told him where to go and where to wait. And then on his way out, he had written that note saying, "I'll see you in a couple of days." When police brought Mike in, he initially denied all charges and said he had nothing to do with this, but he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting to murder his wife. Although Mike never gave his exact motivations for why he actually did this, he would have been ruined financially during this divorce, but if Susan were to die, he would inherit the house. Immediately after his sentencing, Susan sued Mike for $1 million, claiming she wanted to make sure he didn't have any more money so that he couldn't go hire another hitman to finish the job. Susan didn't have to worry for very long though, because Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. As for Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bebo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bebo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot, if they were inside of the aircraft, to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bebo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch, that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bebo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bebo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bebo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bebo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018, none of them have an answer. On that fateful day at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport, where Bebo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bebo arrived at Cargo 1, and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bebo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bebo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1-hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bebo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bebo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bebo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bebo that he really needs needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bebo kind of laughs it off and says, you know, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down. And so as Bebo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bebo to stop what he's doing. And Bebo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bebo becomes remorseful and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bebo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy and he's got a couple of screws loose and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bebo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, but at this point, Bebo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the Earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bebo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bebo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down, you know?
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. I think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, I'll just go nose down and call it a night.
How Bebo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality, he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bebo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and steal all of their sweatpants strings.